Greetings, Lion's Pride in erotic roleplayers, and welcome to Codex Compliant.
Most of the time in this series we'll talk about something like this, that is A, a book, and B, a thing that exists.
So today, let's talk about something that is neither of those things.
Warhammer 40,000 video games. Sometimes they're very good, sometimes they're not, and sometimes they never make it out of production hell. One such game is the topic of today's video, Warhammer 40,000 Dark Millennium Online. The ill-fated 40k MMO that never was, because what else are we supposed to do with our time? Review rulebooks people have repeatedly requested? Pah, I say. Pah. Plus, this channel started with us playing video games, so we thought it would be fun to return to that. Or not, as the case may be, since we can't actually play it, since it never came out. So let's see what happened with Dark Millennium Online.
THQ were the games publisher behind some of the most well-regarded 40k video games yet seen, like the Dawn of War series and Space Marine, as well as some that were less well-regarded, but were often basically fine. Fire Warrior is okay. It's fine. They're all just way too mean about it. Now, think back to March 2007. Here in the UK, we were all riding high off the fact that Scooch had won the right to represent the UK in the Eurovision Song Contest. And then THQ announced that they were making a massively multiplayer online role-playing game based on the Warhammer 40,000 license. It was an exciting time to be alive. This was, of course, still when publishers had the bizarre idea in their heads that MMOs were the way to go, despite the fact they're one of the more expensive kinds of games to make and few actually gain enough traction to stay around. You know, basically what they do with live services now, because the games industry never has to learn a lesson just once.
Vigil Games, based in Austin, Texas, were tasked with developing what early documentation calls Warhammer 40,000 Online, and they got right to work finishing off the development of Darksiders, which, no, is not a Warhammer game, no matter how much it looks like one, but before that was released we got our first trailer for the 40k MMO at E3 2010.
It is a time of war. Demons, aliens, and heretics descend upon the Imperium of Man. The battle lines are drawn. Who do you serve?
The game now had the title Warhammer 40,000 Dark Millennium Online, not to be confused with that box we said we'd make a video on but never did, or the card game of the same name. And the trailer was pretty great, honestly. You had Space Marines doing sick bike tricks, orcs in Orgrimmar, apparently, Titans, there was Warhound Titans. I mean, sure, it all looks a little primitive now, but 2010 was a simpler time. After that initial buzz, not much was said about the game for a while. A couple of new trailers were shown, but a lot of what was in them was already shown in that first one, as well as a shot that I'm pretty sure was lifted from Dawn of War 2. To be fair, some of this lack of progress was probably due to the fact that Vigil were making Darksiders 2 at this time. Can't say I blame them, really. Darksiders 1 did very well for them, and MMOs seem like a real pain to develop. I'd probably put it off too.
But towards the end of 2011, outside pressures meant a huge change to the project. Between things like the poor sales of a bunch of expensive THQ titles and the disastrous U-Draw peripheral, things were looking grim for THQ financially. MMOs are ludicrously expensive to produce and maintain, and there was no way that THQ were able or willing to take that kind of a gamble in the state that they were in. Plus, you know, it was becoming more and more apparent that MMOs weren't the limitless money stream publishers had hoped they were. As an aside, if you were wondering how good THQ's decision-making skills were at this point, well, they released a Homefront novel. How good is this novel? Well, it's based on the video game Homefront.
So, with all that in mind, the Dark Millennium project was scaled down to a single or multiplayer RPG, the first M of MMO cast to the winds. Now named simply Dark Millennium, or possibly Inquisitor, depending on where you look, not to be confused with Inquisitor the book, Inquisitor the game system, Inquisitor the short film, Inquisitor the fanzine, or Inquisitor the other video game, this version of the game would have been a low-priced or free-to-play PC game with lots of add-on content, according to Danny Bilson, who was THQ's former executive vice president of Core Games. Eventually, this became a Borderlands kind of game, i.e. 4-player with drop-in drop-out co-op. Although one of the ideas for this version of the game is that you'd have a customizable capital ship where you'd store all the goodies from your adventures, which would even have quarters for your friends to bunk in, which just sounds delightful, honestly.
In early 2012, rumours of Dark Millennium's cancellation emerged on Twitter. And while at this point the game hadn't actually been cancelled, it was true that the MMO shown in the trailers wasn't going to be happening. So, in a way, the rumours were true. From a certain point of view. THQ's response to these rumours was,
"We have not made any decisions regarding their planned MMO."
Which was just vague enough to not actually answer anything. That March they finally announced to the public that the MMO elements were to be dropped from Dark Millennium to focus on a premium experience with single and multiplayer gameplay, robust digital content and community features, to quote Brian Farrell, the then president and CEO of THQ. Despite this, it seems that behind the scenes, many at THQ wanted the project canned, despite Vigil now confident that they could get the significantly smaller game shipped out on time by the summer of 2013, in spite of the substantial layoffs THQ's financial situation had forced upon them. Around May of 2012, those within THQ got their wish, and Dark Millennium, or Inquisitor, or whatever you wanted to call it by that point, was officially cancelled.
Not that we were told this, mind you. That is the public we, not us personally. It'd be weird if THQ told us personally, although it would have been appreciated. So, as far as anyone outside of THQ and Vigil knew, the game was still in development in one form or another. When December 2012 rolled around, THQ's money woes finally came to a head and they filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. When all of their properties and studios were sold off, people noticed the lack of Dark Millennium on their books, leading to a fairly ridiculous exchange between Jason Schreier and THQ's PR on Kotaku, where they admitted that Dark Millennium Online, the MMO, had been cancelled, but refused to give any details on the status of the scaled down version of the game, even when directly asked. It's equal parts funny and infuriating to read.
Okay, so you're saying the game was cancelled, not turned into a single player game. I just want to get this as clear as possible so our readers understand what's going on and know whether or not to expect a single player Dark Millennium game coming from Vigil at any point in the future.
I'm saying we haven't made any announcements about what the resulting game would be, if any. There's nothing to share until Vigil is ready to announce its next project.
However, we finally got an answer when, unable to find a buyer, Vigil Games closed its doors in January 2013. Although no official announcement about the fate of the game was ever made, I think most people assumed that since both the publisher and the developer of the game were now out of business and the rights to it hadn't been sold, that Dark Millennium, in whatever form it was in by that point, could be safely considered dead. Sadly, these sorts of things tend to happen a lot in the games industry. Loads of talented people will sink time and energy into projects that will just never see the light of day. However, putting together little bits and pieces from interviews, trailers and concept art, we can start to see a little bit of an idea of what Dark Millennium could have been like if it had actually been released.
Now, we have very little information on the later iterations of the game, so we're going to concentrate on the MMO version of Dark Millennium, as it was publicly talked about a lot more. Well, we know it wasn't going to be a straight World of Warcraft clone, where a large portion of the game is just clicking boars to death to collect enough boar arses for whatever orc is paying for them, although they did try making it one early in development, which just leaves us wondering what Slanesh-pleasing depravities would have gone down on its role-playing servers had it been made. Their version of Goldshire would probably rip a new eye of terror. No, Dark Millennium, using the same engine as Darksiders, was intended to be a more action-based MMO involving large firefights, quicker deaths, and vehicles controlled by multiple players. effectively taking Vigil's experience with action-focused gameplay from Darksiders and mixing that with more traditional MMO concepts. A middle ground between the kinetic feedback of single-player fighting and the arcane dance of MMO combat. Although it should be noted that a Tumblr post claiming to be the game's lead writer Chris Pramas did say that the moment-to-moment gameplay was more akin to a standard shooter, with the company's leadership, perhaps mistakenly, believing that inserting the MMO elements in later would be easy.
Set in the Sargos sector, a place Lexicanum describes as a sector on the edges of the galaxy, there was going to be a balance of both PvP and PvE combat, as well as all the regular MMO things, like guilds, exploration, and even mounts in the form of stuff like the bikes we saw doing sick tricks earlier. Even the Warhound Titan we saw was intended to be controlled by players. As far as playable factions go, the only one we could find officially confirmed was the Imperium of Man, although between blog posts, the trailers, and concept art, it looks like Chaos, Eldar, and Orcs were also planned as playable races. As is often the way of these things, the factions would have been split between two big sides of the conflict, which, considering the four factions we're aware of, would probably have been Imperium and Eldar versus Chaos and Orcs. We have a vague recollection of once reading that every faction in 40k would be represented somewhere in the game, although in what capacity many of them would appear is unknown. Also, if we're remembering that correctly, then that's just a dangerous thing to say, since there's always going to be that one arsehole who'll, well, actually you, because you didn't put a HRUD in the game. In the class department, all we're vaguely sure of is that there would have been a tank class, and the presence of weird boys and psychers would suggest a kind of caster class. Although given the more action-oriented skew to the game, it's likely that a lot of the standard MMO class archetypes would work quite differently than in a traditional MMO.
Talking about the player characters, it's interesting that all of the Loyalist Space Marines we see are Black Templars, which maybe they picked because they were just big 3rd edition fans, but probably they picked because it meant that you would then be able to start out as a neophyte, and then not have to worry too much about justifying why they would be fighting in squads alongside higher level full-blown Marines, since that's just canonically how Black Templars roll anyway. I guess it also works out because the Codex Astartes would probably not allow for raid parties anyway. Ultimately though, it is difficult to say exactly how a lot of these things would have functioned in the game, or exactly how far into production this MMO version actually got. Things change a lot during video game production after all, and so much of what we know is based on marketing, leaked information, or by inference from what production material we can find after the fact.
As we've alluded to, plenty of the artists who worked on the game have uploaded some of the work they did for it, and they're really interesting. You can really see a more stylized look coming through, both akin to Vigil's other games and, let's be honest, the heroic proportions of 40k miniatures. It's just got a really fun vibe to it, and kudos to the artists. It's fascinating to see how a lot of it demonstrates how characters could have looked as they leveled up, their armour getting progressively more and more ornate until you can barely see them under all their bells and whistles. It's also neat to see how the artists took existing models and concepts and made new things with them, whether it be fantasy orc elements getting mixed in with the orcs, the 2nd edition Landspeeder design being resurrected as a chaos vehicle, or this Runtmaster design with a very friendly backpack. Also a big fan of this underwater Imperial city that makes me think of how neat it would be to take part in an underwater fight between Marines, since, well, they can just fight underwater if they need to, it just doesn't come up very much. Also, it'd be nice to have the term Space Marine be a little bit more fitting for once. 'Cause they'd be wet.
The death of Dark Millennium was a sad thing for many people. Interviews and statements made by former staff seem to show some real passion despite many seemingly aware that the project was probably doomed from the start. Many staff at Vigil were fans of Warhammer 40,000, even playing in-house tournaments during development. I mean, half the characters in the Darksiders games look like Warhammer minis, so you know there's some love there. What we saw of the game looked pretty cool, and it would have been nice to have a 40k MMO to go with the then ongoing Warhammer Fantasy MMO Age of Reckoning. Dark Millennium didn't look like anything groundbreaking, of course, but a 40k game of the size and scope initially suggested was an alluring prospect. alluring enough that at E3 2013, a new attempt at a 40k MMO was announced by the folks at Behaviour Interactive called Eternal Crusade. Sadly, it too suffered radical changes and downsizing throughout its development and came out of early access in September 2016 as a basically unfinished third-person shooter. And it was not great. I mean, some people really liked it, but those people were not us. It eventually went free to play, which I'm sure made those people who paid for some of those big Founders packs incredibly happy, and by this point the game is quite dead, its servers having shut down on the 10th of September 2021, meaning anyone trying to play it today is met only with an error message. Fair play to them though, it lasted a lot longer than we expected it to.
And maybe Dark Millennium Online would have suffered the same fate as Eternal Crusade had it ever come out. People left disappointed because the original promise couldn't be met due to boring reasons like money and feasibility. After all, the game that was actually cancelled was nothing like the game shown back in 2010. And I suppose at least the scaled down version of the game, the 40k 4-player co-op shooter, has now been realised a couple of times with 2016's Space Hulk Deathwing and 2022's Darktide. Not to mention the Warhammer Fantasy Vermintide games. They're all pretty good. Mostly.
So maybe Dark Millennium Online was just never meant to be, doomed the moment it was announced. Now it remains as just a memory, a relic of the MMO gold rush and a tantalising view of what could have been.
Maybe it would have been really good. Maybe it would have been really, really bad. We will never be able to know. But there's a part of us deep down that just can't help but covet what we cannot have.
Hello everybody, thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it then please consider tapping that like button and maybe absolutely smashing that subscribe one also. You could even venture forth to patreon.com/snipeandwib like the brave souls whose names are passing by now. Thank you to Naerina and PleasantKenobi for recording lines for this video, and also want to give a quick shout out to the artists whose work for Vigil we've used in this video, specifically John J. O'Mahony III, Jenica Durson, Peter Richmond, Denny Zunon and James Bryan Jones, Jeremy Klein, Michael Bierrick, Robert Barrett, Alison Theus, Ted Bergin, Sean Brack, Josh Singh and Eric Spittler. Thanks for putting all your work online, made this video a lot easier to make. There's a couple of pieces in there that we're not sure who did them, but whoever you are also cool. Would you believe that the first version of this video's script was actually written in 2017, before this series even started? Yeah, this is an idea we've had floating around for a while, so it's nice to finally put this out, even if very few words remain from that original version. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking now. Bye.